All right, so that's kind of our discussion about these well-behaved indifference curves, or well-behaved preferences, and then what that implies for the shape of the indifference curves. I mean, hopefully this is on the screen, but now we're going to talk about the marginal rate of substitution. We often call this just MRS. It's a bit of a mouthful, the marginal rate of substitution. And this is essentially the slope of the indifference curve. So the MRS is the change in x2 over the change in x1 along this indifference curve. So it's the rate at which the individual is willing to sub good 1, oh, sub good 2, I should say, to good 1, and still remain indifferent towards the bundles. You want to think about the change in x1 and the change in x2 being very small amounts. And smaller and smaller you make this change in x1, the closer it is to the slope of the indifference curve. And next chapter in the appendix, we'll start, actually thinking about calculating the MRS by taking the derivative of, let's say, this utility function, or sorry, derivative of this indifference curve, basically. So if we want to draw it out, x2 for the amount of good 2 and x1 for the amount of good 1, we have this indifference curve that has this nice convex shape. Label it I1. So we want to basically take in, could have done this a different color. Imagine we're interested in this point. We're just taking the slope at that point, which is the change in x2, and this is the change in x1. And that's kind of the slope of the line at this point, right? And so taking at different points is going to have different slopes of this line. So typically this is going to be a negative number, which might be a bit confusing because lots of time economists would kind of say it as a positive number, even if the slope is negative, because you're trading. You're reducing your amount of x2 and seeing how much x1 needs to go up to stay on the same indifference curve. But it's a negative number because of the assumptions we made about monotonic preferences. But a lot of times you see economists kind of say that expressed as a positive number because the assumption is that we know the slope is negative. Since monotonic preferences have a negative slope. All right. So let's explore this kind of concept of marginal rate of substitution a bit more by looking at traits. So suppose the consumer, suppose the individual has well-behaved preferences. In the sense that they're monotonic and convex. So they have well-behaved preferences, and they are currently consuming at x1, x2. Now let's say we offer them a trade. exchange, good 1, for good 2 at a rate of E. E is this exchange rate. So what does this mean? Well, it means if they give up delta x1 of good 1 they can get E times delta x1 of good 2. And vice versa. If they give up delta x2 of good 2, then they would get delta x2 over E of good 2. Oops, of good 1, I should say. So essentially, what we're doing here is we're giving the opportunity for the consumer to consume anywhere along a straight line that passes through x1, x2, that has a slope, I guess, of negative E. That's essentially the option we're giving the consumer. So essentially, we are giving the option of consuming anywhere along a line with slope negative E that passes through x1, x2, the current bundle they're having. So that's essentially, so let's kind of, let me erase this and draw it out, and hopefully it'll make a bit more sense, I think, when I kind of draw out the option that we're giving the consumer here. So let's kind of visualize this exchange that we're offering the consumer. So x2 and x1, let's just draw a few indifference curves here. I1, I2, I3. All right, so let's imagine that we're at this point. This is the exact amount of x1 and x2 where the consumer is currently consuming, that bundle X that we were talking about before. And now we're offering this exchange, this exchange rate of E. Essentially, that's creating, I'm gonna have to redraw some indifference curves here in a second, a straight line for a rate of exchange that has a slope of negative E, right? That's the exchange we're offering this consumer. I just want to illustrate something, so I'm going to draw something. I'm going to redraw this second indifference curve. So it just touches this exchange rate line somewhere. Okay, maybe I should have drawn in a different order. So we're at this bundle X, that's what we're consuming. And now we're offering this exchange rate of E in terms of being able to exchange this good. So if we start off at this point X and we move anywhere up and to the left, that means we're trading for good 2. We move up and left, we are trading for good 2. If we move down and right, we are trading for good 1. So here, if we're at X and we offer this exchange rate of negative E, the consumer is going to start trading for good 2 because they could get to this higher indifference curve way up here. So they would trade, right? So the only time a consumer is not going to trade is if the slope of, this indifference curve is exactly the slope of this exchange rate. So it's exactly E. So only time the individual would not want to trade or exchange is if the exchange rate equals the slope of the indifference curve, which is just the marginal rate of substitution. So that needs to be tangent, right? That's how we can say that. It's the same slope, so it's just tangent. So essentially what the MRS is it measures the rate at which the individual or the consumer is just on the margin of trading and not trading. At that exchange rate, right? Like the MRS measures the rate, this exchange rate at which the consumer is on just on the margin of wanting to trade and not wanting to trade. So that's one way of thinking about this marginal rate of substitution. Now let's think about it in a slightly different way.